One life is all we have, and we live it as we believe in living it. But to sacrifice what you are and to live without belief, that is a fate more terrible than dying.
Hello everyone. It is time for a new biography, and today with my guest who you just heard, Springbok ASMR, we would like to give you an introduction to the life of one of the most famous women in history, Joan of Arc. I would like to thank Springbok for accepting to be part of this video. She recorded these quotes attributed to Joan of Arc almost 1 year ago, and then we both went on a break from which we just returned. Anyway, I hope you like this collaboration, and if you're interested in more medieval topics, I will put in the description of this video links to other videos I made, like the one about the 100 Years' War. I'm going to refer to it in the course of this one, like the Wars of the Roses, the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, and maybe a few other ones I'm not thinking about right now. But it's now time for you to close your eyes, put your headsets on. I'm going to show you, as usual, a few maps and pictures, but you don't need them to understand the story, to follow it with us. So you can just relax and let the sound of our voices guide you in this journey to the past.
I was in my 13th year when I heard a voice from God to help me govern my conduct. And the first time, I was very much afraid.
At first sight, the story of Joan of Arc, as it is often told and made popular, looks more like a fairy tale or a legend than serious historical facts. I'm sure you already heard about it. It says that in the midst of the 100 Years' War, when the situation of the King of France was extremely precarious, a girl, a peasant girl, coming from nowhere, claiming she heard mystical voices from saints and angels, suddenly appeared, turned into a military leader, helped the king to recover his lost kingdom, before being captured by the enemy, finally trialed and burnt alive, like a martyr. There are true facts in this story, but the reality is maybe less supernatural and more complex than this, and this is what we're going to try to explore together today. But still, there are mysteries surrounding the character of Joan of Arc. We have sources, the documents from her trial, letters she sent. She didn't write them herself because she never learned to read and write, and also various testimonies. But despite all this, there is still a thick layer of mystery surrounding this story. We have periods when we lose her trace, sometimes during weeks or months, which is a lot given that her time as a public figure lasted about 2 years only. And there is the question of the supernatural. Are these voices real? Are they lies? Are they the product of the imagination of a crazy girl? I don't know, but what I know is that following the footsteps of Joan of Arc is fascinating, and even though her story is pretty short, it's going to replace us in the midst of the 100 Years' War, in years of terrible insecurity, in years when people believed in the supernatural. And we are also going to discover a person who was certainly much more complex and human than the legend would let us think in the first place.
The voice said to me, "Go into France." I could stay no longer. It said to me, "Go, raise the siege which is being made before the city of Orleans. Go," it added, "to Robert de Baudricourt, captain of Vaucouleurs. He will furnish you with an escort to accompany you." And I replied that I was but a poor girl who knew nothing of riding or fighting.
By the end of the 1420s, a young girl, she was probably 16, 17 years old, coming from a small village called Domremy in the region of Lorraine. This is the northeast of France today. Managed to meet the local lord and get an escort from him to go meet the King of France himself. She said she had received a divine mission. She had to go meet the king, liberate the city of Orléans, which was then besieged by English forces, and then accompany the king to his coronation, which had not taken place yet. Why did she need an escort to meet the king? Because this would imply crossing enemy lines. And to understand why, we have to talk a little bit about the context. The 100 Years' War had started long before, about a century before, when the ruling dynasty in England, the Plantagenets, claimed the crown of France for a variety of reasons. For dynastic reasons, they had a strong claim to the throne of France, also for political and economical reasons. But the nobility in France and the ruling dynasty, the Valois, which had a pretender, rejected the claim, and this is how the war began. Initially, much to the advantage of the King of England, the French armies lost several battles, and the English seized considerable territories on the continent. But by the end of the 14th century, the situation had been reversed, and the kings of France had recovered most of these lost territories, almost expelling the English from the continent. However, in 1415, about 15 years before the events we're going to talk about, the new King of England, Henry V, revived the war and started a new invasion of northern France. And the offensive met considerable success at first. He won a famous battle at Azincourt, and the Kingdom of France seemed to be falling apart. One of the most powerful vassals of the King of France, the Duke of Burgundy, revolted against his suzerain and allied with the English. Whereas the king was incompetent, he was mentally ill and manipulated by the people surrounding him in his court. This string of English victories and Burgundian victories against the Valois dynasty led to the signing of a treaty that was disastrous for the Valois in 1420. The treaty said that after the death of Charles VI, the crown of France would be inherited by the son of Henry V, which meant that the successor to the ruling Plantagenet king would be King of England and France, ensuring the victory of the Plantagenets. But shortly after the treaty was signed, both Charles VI and Henry V died, meaning that the successor to the crown of England, the son of Henry V, was still a child, and the treaty did not come into force, the Valois continuing to reject this treaty and refusing to abandon the crown to the Plantagenets. So the war resumed, and by the late 1420s, the situation was that all the north of France was occupied by English and Burgundian forces, including the city of Paris, and the Valois had found refuge in the southern half of France, with a new capital city in the city of Bourges, which is geographically at the center of France. And 4 years, France had had no crowned king. The Plantagenet was still a child, and he lived in England, and the Valois was unable to go to the city of Coronation, the city of Reims, because it was behind enemy lines. In the north of the kingdom, north of the Loire River, there were only 2 places that remained loyal to Charles VII, the Valois pretender to the crown, the city of Tournai, which is in Flanders, and the region of Domremy, this village Joan of Arc came from. But even though on a map the frontiers seem to be clear, in reality the Burgundians and the English controlled mainly the cities. The rest of the countryside was extremely chaotic. There were groups of soldiers and mercenaries attacking travelers, attacking villages, and actually during the childhood of Joan, her village was attacked and her house was burned by a group of soldiers. However precarious it may seem to be, the situation of the King of France was not completely desperate, because the English and the Burgundians did not intend to immediately attack him with all of their forces. The English were facing financial problems and could no longer afford to go on the offensive, at least not a major one, so they were besieging cities, especially in the valley of the Loire. Burgundians were not willing to attack neither, because the Duke of Burgundy was quite happy with the status quo. He was not fighting for the English, he was fighting for himself, and this situation with the Kingdom of France shared between 2 pretenders put him in a good position to negotiate his alliance with one of them. So that by 1429 the situation looked pretty bad for the Valois. They were not about to collapse, but they were unable to break this alliance between the Burgundians and the English, and they were in a wait-and-see situation, trying to avoid losing more cities to the English who were besieging them. And this is why Joan of Arc needed an escort to go meet the king. The place she lived was behind enemy lines, and she would have to cross land belonging to the Duke of Burgundy before arriving in Bourges. Given the political and military situation, her claims that she would liberate Orléans and accompany the king to his coronation looked absurd to people who knew about the situation. However, there had been prophecies, legends in the countryside for decades talking about a girl which one day, led by the Holy Ghost, would help liberate the kingdom. These kind of legends were known by most people in the northeast of France, and it is likely that Joan of Arc and her family heard about this. She was from a modest family, but not the poorest of the poorest. Her parents had 50 acres of land, which was quite a lot back then, and even though she received no particular education, as I said before, she was unable to read, and she knew about nothing about history or geography. She was apparently extremely pious. She prayed a lot and spent a lot of time at the church, even more than what was required back then. She also spent a lot of time alone in her childhood, caring for the cattle, And it is during these hours spent in a meadow with the cattle that she started to have or pretend she had visions or voices speaking to her, with saints and angels appearing and initially telling her to be a good girl, to go to church regularly, until when she became a teenager at 16, 17, they started to tell her about her divine mission.
Of the love or hatred God has for the English, I know nothing. But I do know that they will all be thrown out of France, except those who die there.
The journey from Vaucouleurs to the royal court in Bourges lasted for 11 days, during which Joan and her small escort of soldiers had to avoid big cities, travel in the countryside, but they safely arrived, and she was now expecting to finally meet the future king. During this trip, she dressed as a man, probably because that was more convenient, but that's something that for people back then was extremely strange, even shocking. We have to remember that it's only in the 20th century, in most European countries, that dressing as a man became legal for a woman. Before that, it was seen as extremely subversive, and women could be prosecuted for cross-dressing. This is actually one of the charges or pretexts that would be held against her during her trial a couple years later. We know very little about her appearance. She was apparently not that beautiful nor ugly, and it seems, given the absence of testimony about what she looked like, that people were so impressed by her faith and her dedication to her mission that they didn't pay much attention to what she looked like. Even though she is generally represented wearing an armor or in a military suit, we know that most of the time she dressed as a woman, and apparently she even liked to have beautiful dresses. We know that thanks to the gifts that were made to her by the cities, especially the city of Orléans, where she became a heroine slightly later after the liberation of the city from the siege. However, the arrival in Bourges started with a disappointment because she did not manage to be granted an audience immediately with the king. She had to wait for several days, and this put her in a very angry mood. If there is one thing we can be sure of, it is that she had no doubt about her mission. She was extremely sincere and radical when it came to her fate, but it was not the first time a young girl like her tried to meet the king or any representative of the authority, saying they were invested with a divine mission. There were these prophecies I mentioned before, and Joan was just seen as one of these girls pretending they had received a divine inspiration. So actually she was not taken very seriously by the authorities at the royal court, but she was finally allowed to meet the king. At this point there is another legend saying that she would have entered a room, and in order to test her, the king would have hidden in the crowd, but she would have been able to immediately find him, even though she had never met him before. This was probably made up at a later stage because there is no trace of this in the archives. But what we do know is that at some point, and one way or another, she managed to get the king's attention. Maybe based on testimonies we have, she did so by talking to him about a secret prayer that he would have made months before, and he would have been impressed because no one knew about it except him. It didn't mean the king was illuminated by Joan of Arc and immediately wanted to give her a military command, quite the opposite actually. In Bourges, which was not very far from the besieged city of Orléans, an expedition was being prepared. The Valois did not expect to free the city, at least not yet. They just wanted to supply it. Because as I said before, the English had limited means, financially and militarily, so the siege was not complete. One of the doors of the city was still free of occupiers, and it was possible to resupply the inhabitants of Orléans, which had already been done several times before. And the king, Charles VII, agreed that maybe Joan of Arc could be sent with this expedition, certainly not as a military leader, because he did not intend her to fight at any point, but like a mascot, someone that would give faith and boost the morale of the inhabitants of Orléans and the small troop that accompanied this convoy to the besieged city. There was a clear misunderstanding at this stage. The king and people around him saw Joan of Arc as a mascot, mainly. But Joan of Arc didn't see things this way. She believed she had been sent on a military expedition, and she sent a letter to the English besieging Orléans, a letter we still have today.
King of England, and you, Duke of Bedford, who call yourself regent of the kingdom of France, settle your debt to the King of Heaven. Return to the maiden, who is the envoy of the King of Heaven, the keys to all the good towns you took and violated in France.
The convoy arrives in Orléans and successfully resupplies the city in April 1429. The leader of the expedition is a general called Dunois. In this expedition, Joan has no particular role, no status, other than being here to cheer the troops, but she keeps insisting that it's now time to attack, and this is another mystery about her, very much like she had achieved to convince the Lord of Vaucouleurs to give her an escort to Bourges, like she had convinced the king to let her go with the expedition to Orléans. She managed to persuade Dunois to do something to try and break the siege around the city. As I said before, the city was not entirely surrounded, and the convoy had been able to enter to resupply, and the English had built or established fortified positions all around Orléans, using barns, houses, or sometimes bigger buildings that they had fortified and from which they could control the surroundings, preventing people from exiting or entering the town. A modest assault, given Joan's insistence, was agreed upon and launched against one of the smallest of these fortifications. Joan put herself at the head of the small group of soldiers that attacked, and they managed to take the position. Then they attacked a bigger one, and that was another victory. And just in a matter of hours, a couple of days, all the fortifications around Orléans on the 8th of May 1429 had been retaken almost by surprise. On the second day of fighting, Joan, who showed an incredible bravery, having no fear of danger, received an arrow and was hurt. She was taken to the rear, but she insisted on coming back and continued to participate in the various assaults launched against these fortified positions. To the surprise of both sides, the city had been freed in just a matter of days, after 7 months of siege, and we have to understand that Joan of Arc actually hijacked this army, who was not under her command, and almost forced her, and then, thanks to the first successes, received support from the commanders to attack the English. If there was something miraculous or looking like a miracle in Joan of Arc's epic, it is this liberation of the city. Something that generals and professional soldiers had not been able to achieve in 7 months, and that a young girl, she was 16, 17 by then, just by inspiring the troops and launching frontal assaults, managed to do. The liberation of Orléans turned Joan of Arc into a heroine of a night for the inhabitants of the city, and still today the city commemorates every year this liberation. The following weeks were extremely beneficial to the Valois. Following this early success, more attacks took place in the Loire Valley, and other smaller towns were retaken, and this campaign culminated in June 1429, a month and a half after the liberation of Orléans at the Battle of Patay. Not surprisingly, the English know much about the Battle of Azincourt, and the French often refer more to the Battle of Patay. Both battles were disasters for the opposite side. In Azincourt, British bowmen, protected by pikes that prevented the French cavalry from attacking them, had been able to decimate the French knights. In Patay, it worked the other way around. The vanguard of the French army surprised the reinforcements sent by the English and charged a large group of bowmen, resulting in the loss of 2,500 soldiers for the English against just a few dozens on the French side. The Battle of Patay effectively ended the English military presence in the north of France for the following month, and even though Joan of Arc was not part of this battle, she was coming with the army, but just the vanguard fought, and when she arrived on the battlefield, the battle was already over. Even though she was still not a commander, and cannot be credited for all these victories, she clearly contributed to them by making hope change side, and the belief that she was really God sent and had a divine mission only grew among the French troops. Even though all of northern France remains in English and Burgundian hands, Joan of Arc persuades the king to now go to Reims for his coronation. On the way to Reims, Joan's magic seems to continue to work. She now stands next to the king, and almost all cities on the way, even though they are in Burgundian and English territories, supposedly, open their doors to the coronation party, impressed by the rumor of the Valois victories in the Loire Valley and the aura of this young girl who pretends to be sent by God to accomplish his will. The only city that doesn't open its doors, Troyes, is attacked immediately and immediately surrenders to Charles VII. By mid-July, just 2 months and a half after the retaking of Orléans, Charles VII is crowned King of France in Reims, strongly reinforcing his legitimacy as the true King of France, and this combined with the military defeats of the English seems to dramatically change the course of events in the 100 Years' War. Actually, even the Duke of Burgundy has become more friendly, seeing that the wind has changed direction, and now comes closer to the King of France. At this coronation, Joan is at the height of her status, her reputation, and her influence on the king. She's just 17. She has accomplished the two main goals these mysterious voices had given her: the liberation of Orléans, the coronation of the king. The rest of her story is going to be much sadder.
Children say the people are hung sometimes for speaking the truth.
For the next 10 months, Joanne continues to campaign against Burgundy and England in northern France, generally with success, but nothing as brilliant as the retaking of Orléans or the Battle of Patay. And she faces a big failure trying to retake Paris. The city refuses to surrender. This is a much bigger city than the other ones she attacked, and despite her passionate pleas to the defenders to surrender, they refuse and she proves unable to take the city. At the same time, she begins to lose credit, it may sound surprising, at the court. She was extremely useful in 1429 to liberate Orléans, to boost the legitimacy of Charles VII. But now diplomacy is coming back, and at the royal court, the king and his councillors still hope to end the war diplomatically by now convincing the Duke of Burgundy to abandon his alliance with England, and by very progressively, at low cost, get back all the cities that have been invaded after 1415. In front of that, Joanne's strategy is much more aggressive. She wants to launch frontal assaults in every direction, and she clearly becomes annoying now to people who never really believed that she had supernatural powers or that she was inspired by God. They've been impressed by her achievements, but they still believe that she just had luck and was the right person at the right place at the right moment. In a move that clearly indicates that she is now isolated, the king makes her a noble. It may look like a promotion, and in a sense it is, as a thank you gift for everything she did for him, but being a noble means that she now becomes allowed to independently attack the English, and this clearly means that now Charles VII is no longer going to support her. Thanks to donations, she hires a group of mercenaries, about 200 men, and try to continue her war. She now becomes a military commander, even though with a tiny army. And her misfortunes begin in May 1430. She is taken in a skirmish against the Burgundians near the town of Compiègne, in the north of France. She falls from her horse and is captured by them. A very tough period, ultimately leading to her death, is now going to begin. She is kept prisoner by the Burgundians, and a few months later she is handed over by them to the English and taken to the city of Rouen in Normandy, far from the land controlled by Charles VII. To the English, Joan of Arc is a political threat. Her shorter adventure, what she has achieved or helped achieve, is exhilarating for all the followers of the Valois, of Charles VII. This aura, this status, this belief she has spread among the French population that she is sent by God himself, have to be destroyed. They don't necessarily want her dead. They want this persona, this icon, to disappear. And the best way for this is to put God on your own side by using the Inquisition and have her trialed as a heretic. In this process, the English benefit from support from the University of Paris. We have to know that back then in the Middle Age, when it came to theology, the University of Paris was a major power in Europe. During the whole Middle Age, it had a strong influence. Several popes came from it, and all the sayings of the University of Paris were highly respected and regarded in the entire Christianity. But Paris was under English influence still, it had not been retaken yet, and conveniently, the University of Paris was always supporting the ruler of the French capital. So the plan, with the backing of the University of Paris that would provide theological respectability, was to undo this propaganda that had benefited the Valois by condemning Joan as a heretic. The trial began in March 1431 in Rouen. She was only 19, and the goal is to make her recant, to make her admit that she is a heretic, that she lied and behaved badly, which would cast doubt on the coronation of Charles VII. During the entire trial, with the exception of one moment, she's going to show a lot of resilience, to be very brave again. We have the transcripts of the trial, and every time she was challenged, she tried to answer with common sense, and she proved that she was smart too, trying to avoid the traps that were handed to her. For example, when asked whether she believed she was in a place of innocence, she answered,
"If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me."
On just one occasion during the trial, she weakened and yielded under pressure. The trial was nearing its end, and because she remained obstinate, she was charged in particular with the charge of presumption. This qualified the fact that she had been claiming divine revelation, and also the charge of immodesty. This meant she had been wearing male clothes, and as a woman she was not allowed to. And hearing that because she remained obstinate she would be handed over for punishment by the civil powers, the death sentence, she finally recanted and pleaded guilty with the promise that her sentence would be changed to perpetual imprisonment. But 3 days later, she retracted, maintaining that everything she stood for she still believed in, so there was no turning back now. A few days later, by the end of May 1431, she was burned at the stake as a relapsed heretic. Burnt alive, I don't know if you can imagine how painful and frightening this must have been for a young girl like her.
Alas, that my body, clean and whole, never been corrupted, today must be consumed and burnt to ashes.
The 100 Years' War officially ended 20 years after Joan's death in 1453. Charles VII ruled over France for 30 years after her death and managed to end the reconquest of almost all of France. Only the northern city of Calais remained in English hands. In the decades following her death, and because her contribution to the status, the legitimacy of Charles VII had been considerable, he put pressure on the Pope and the Church for Joan of Arc to be officially rehabilitated. Until he did so, she was still considered officially a heretic by the Church and the Inquisition. Joan of Arc remained a controversial subject in the following centuries. The topic was uncomfortable for the Church, given that she had been condemned officially by the Inquisition. For the kings of France until the French Revolution, on the opposite, she was a symbol of the kingdom's independence and resilience to invaders. In the 19th century, with the development of nationalism pretty much everywhere in Europe and including in France, Joan started to change status in popular culture. She became a national heroine. And ironically, she had been condemned for political reasons, rehabilitated for political reasons, and she would also be beatified and made a Catholic saint for political reasons in the 20th century, about almost 5 centuries after her death. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the Vatican, the Catholic Church, was trying to improve its relations with the French Republic. This is another story, but to make it short, let's say that in the 19th century, the Vatican and the Catholic hierarchy in France fought against the establishment of a republic. They wanted a monarchy and they wanted to retain their influence in education and at every level of the society. So that, for a part, and this explains a lot of things you see in contemporary France, the Republic built itself against Catholicism or against the influence of the Church in the society. This culminated with the separation of Church and State by the beginning of the 20th century. Finally, seeing that the Republic was well established and that there were worse things than a republic, like Marxism or socialism, the Vatican tried to mend fences with the French Republic and improve the relations. This is how the beatification process of Joan of Arc began, as a symbolic gift to a nation where nationalism was particularly strong back then. Remember that in the 1910s there was the First World War, and by 1920 she was made a saint. Nowadays very few people really believe that heavens could take side in a war between 2 Christian countries, but Joan of Arc remains reminded universally. She is known pretty much everywhere in the world as a young woman with a tragic fate and as an example of the power of inspiration and faith. As usual, I hope you like this presentation. There is much more to learn about this period and the character, but I hope this video gives you appetite to learn more, and I hope I'll see you soon for another video. Au revoir.